The key felt heavy in my hand as I stood before the imposing Victorian mansion that had been in my family for generations. Summer heat pressed against my skin, while crickets chirped their endless symphony in the overgrown garden. This was the last place I wanted to be. But as the only grandchild still speaking to the family, the task of clearing out my grandfather's house had fallen to me. Just donate everything to charity, Oliver, my mother had said dismissively over the phone. That house holds nothing but dust and bad memories. But I knew better. My grandfather, Jonathan Sterling, wasn't the type of man to leave nothing behind. As the founder of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, once the largest pharmaceutical company in the state, he had built an empire from nothing, an empire that was mysteriously acquired by Marshall Industries 30 years ago, just months before his death. The front door creaked open, the sound echoing through empty halls that once rang with laughter during family gatherings. Family, the word left a bitter taste in my mouth. These days, the Sterlings barely acknowledged each other's existence. My father drowned himself in whiskey. My mother buried herself in social functions, and my siblings scattered across the country, all of us carrying wounds from the day Sterling Pharmaceuticals slipped through our fingers. I was only 7 when it happened, but I remember the chaos, the shouting matches, the slammed doors, the whispered accusations. Grandfather had sold out, they said. He had betrayed the family legacy. But I remembered something else too, the look in his eyes the last time I saw him. Not defeat, not shame, but a fierce determination that I never understood until now. The attic door stood before me, its ancient hinges protesting as I pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, swirling around stacks of boxes and sheet-covered furniture. The air was thick with the musty smell of forgotten memories. "Let's see what secrets you kept, grandfather," I muttered, setting down my cleaning supplies. Hours passed as I sorted through decades of accumulated history. Old photographs, Christmas decorations, boarding school reports, each item a fragment of the Sterling story. My back ached, and sweat trickled down my neck in a stifling heat. I was about to call it a day when my hand brushed against something behind a heavy oak dresser. The wallpaper felt different there, newer, somehow. Pressing my fingers against it, I felt a slight give. My heart began to race as I carefully peeled back the paper, revealing a small door set into the wall. It was painted to match its surroundings perfectly, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "Clever, grandfather?" I whispered, examining the keyhole. It was an old-fashioned lock, the kind you rarely see anymore. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the ring of keys I'd found in grandfather's study. The third key slid in smoothly, and with a satisfying click, the door swung open. Inside was a safe. Not some modern electronic model, but a heavy iron antique with a combination dial. My flashlight beam revealed a series of scratches around the dial. Someone had tried to crack it and failed. I sat back on my heels, mind racing. The combination. What would grandfather have used? Birth dates were too obvious, anniversary dates too simple for a man like him. Then I remembered something, a conversation from long ago, one of our Sunday chess matches. "Numbers are like people, Oliver," he'd said, eyes twinkling. "The important ones hide in plain sight." I reached for my phone, pulling up an old article about Sterling Pharmaceuticals. There it was, the company's founding date, 03/14/1962. My fingers trembled as I turned the dial. 31,462. The safe door opened with a soft hiss. Inside, Stacked neatly were folders, documents, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's elegant script. But what caught my eye was a small leather notebook, its pages yellow with age. As I opened it, a newspaper clipping fluttered to the floor. The headline made my blood run cold. Sterling Pharmaceuticals acquired by Marshall Industries in surprise takeover. Below the article, in my grandfather's handwriting, were two words that changed everything. Not acquired, stolen. I began reading the notebook, and with each page, the true story of Sterling Pharmaceuticals' fall emerged. A story of betrayal, forged documents, and millions of dollars in embezzled funds. A story that led straight to the current CEO of Marshall Industries, Richard Marshall Jr. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Have you cleared out that dusty old house yet?" I looked at the evidence in my hands, 30 years of carefully preserved truth, and smiled. "No, Mother," I typed back. "I'm just getting started." The next morning, I sat in my apartment, documents spread across my dining room table. I hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. The story laid out in my grandfather's notebooks was almost too incredible to believe. Almost. According to his detailed records, Richard Marshall Sr., the former CEO of Marshall Industries, had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to force the acquisition of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. He had planted spies within the company, manipulated stock prices, and ultimately used forged documents to seize control of my grandfather's life's work. But grandfather hadn't gone down without a fight. He had gathered evidence, documented everything. The safe contained proof of illegal stock manipulation, copies of the original documents next to their forged counterparts, and a complete trail of the money Marshall had embezzled to fund the takeover. "Why didn't you expose them?" I whispered to the empty room. The answer came in the form of a letter, the one with my name on it. "My dearest Oliver, if you're reading this, you found what I couldn't risk revealing in life. Marshall didn't just steal my company, he threatened everything I held dear. He made it clear that if I fought the takeover, accidents would happen. Fatal accidents. To my children, my grandchildren, you. I chose family over fortune, Oliver, but I never gave up. I've spent years gathering evidence, building a case that would be impossible to dispute. Now it's in your hands. You were always different from the others. You saw beyond the surface, just like I did. That's why I'm trusting you with this. Inside this safe is everything you need to reclaim what was stolen from us. Be smarter than I was. Be more careful. And remember, in business, like in chess, the key to victory is making your opponent think they're winning until the very end. All my love, grandfather." I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Diana, it's Oliver Sterling. Remember when you said you owed me a favor? I need the best corporate lawyer in the city. No, not for a consultation. I need someone who's ready for war." 2 hours later, I sat across from Diana Chen in her corner office on the 40th floor of the city's most prestigious law firm. Her reputation for handling complex corporate cases was legendary, and right now I needed a legend. "Let me get this straight," she said, examining the documents I'd brought. "You have evidence that Marshall Industries acquired Sterling Pharmaceuticals through fraud 30 years ago, and you want to what? Get it back." I met her gaze steadily. "Not just get it back. I want to take everything they built using my grandfather's stolen legacy." Diana leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You do realize Marshall Industries is now one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. This won't be easy. It won't be quick. And it certainly won't be cheap. I have something better than money, I replied, sliding my grandfather's notebook across her desk. I have the truth. She spent the next hour reviewing the evidence, her expression growing more intrigued with each page. Finally, she looked up. This is explosive stuff, Oliver, but Marshall Industries has an army of lawyers and virtually unlimited resources. Why come to me? I smiled, remembering my grandfather's words about chess. Because you're not just good, Diana, you're patient. And for what I have planned, we're going to need patience. And what exactly do you have planned? Marshall stole my grandfather's company through deception and manipulation. I intend to return the favor, but legally, and in a way they'll never see coming. Diana's eyes sparkled with interest. Tell me more. For the next 3 hours, I outlined my strategy. It wasn't just about lawsuits and legal challenges, though those would come. It was about using Marshall's own tactics against them, about applying pressure points they didn't even know existed. By the time I left Diana's office, the sun was setting over the city skyline. My phone had 17 missed calls from my mother, probably wondering why I hadn't finished clearing out the house yet. I smiled, thinking of the safe and its contents, now secured in Diana's office. The game was about to begin, and Richard Marshall Jr. had no idea he was already playing. 3 months after discovering my grandfather's safe, I sat in a sleek downtown coffee shop, watching Richard Marshall Jr. through the window of his corner office in the Marshall Industries Tower. Even from across the street, his arrogance was visible in the way he moved, the way he gestured at his subordinates. He had no idea that his world was about to crumble. Target confirmed. A voice spoke in my earpiece. He's taking his usual 2 p.m. meeting. I checked my watch. Everything was right on schedule. Proceed with Phase 1, Marcus. Marcus Wilson, formerly Marshall Industries head of cybersecurity, now worked for me. It hadn't been hard to convince him to switch sides, not after Diana uncovered evidence of how Marshall had been systematically underpaying and exploiting their tech staff. You know, Marcus's voice crackled through the earpiece. When you first approached me about this, I thought you were crazy. But seeing these documents, the way they've been operating, it's worse than we thought. He was right. The deeper we dug into Marshall Industries, the more rot we found. My grandfather's evidence was just the beginning. 3 decades of corruption had left a trail, and we'd spent months following every lead, documenting every transgression. My phone buzzed. Diana was calling. The SEC filing just went through, she said without preamble. Sterling Holdings now officially owns 4.9% of Marshall Industries stock. We're just under the reporting threshold. I smiled, watching Richard Jr. gesture animatedly in his meeting. How long until he notices? Given the shell companies we used, could be weeks, maybe months. They're not looking for us because they don't know we exist. Perfect. Phase 1 was complete. We had our foot in the door. Now for Phase 2. I opened my laptop, reviewing the plan we'd spent months crafting. Sterling Holdings, the company I'd created using some of my grandfather's hidden assets, had been quietly acquiring Marshall Industries stock through various shell corporations. But that was just the surface play. The real strategy went deeper. Over the past 3 months, we'd identified key employees within Marshall Industries, people who had been marginalized, overlooked, or wronged by the company's corrupt leadership. People with access to sensitive information, people who, with the right motivation, might be willing to help us. Marcus was just the first. There was Sarah Chen, head of research and development, who had watched Marshall take credit for her breakthrough developments. James Martinez in accounting, who had been keeping a secret record of financial irregularities for years. And most importantly, Elizabeth Marshall, Richard Jr.'s own sister, who had been systematically pushed out of the company's leadership, despite owning significant shares. My phone buzzed again, a text from James. Financial reports altered as requested. They'll show up in tomorrow's internal audit. I typed back a quick acknowledgement, then turned to my next task. The internal audit wasn't just any review. It was a carefully orchestrated revelation of decades of financial manipulation. Not enough to raise immediate alarms, but sufficient to start whispers, create doubt, make people look closer at the company's books. Oliver, Diana's voice came through my earpiece. Elizabeth Marshall just confirmed. She wants to meet. This was crucial. Elizabeth Marshall had been the dark horse in her family's company, brilliant but sidelined by her brother's ambition. Our research suggested she had never approved of how Richard Jr. ran the company. Where and when? Tonight. Her beach house in Hampton. She's insisting on complete privacy. I closed my laptop, gathering my things. Tell her I'll be there. The drive to Hampton gave me time to think. Everything hinged on this meeting. Elizabeth Marshall wasn't just any potential ally, she was the key to our entire strategy. Her beach house was modest by Marshall's standards, a mere 6 bedrooms with a private beach. As I pulled up, I noticed security cameras tracking my movement. Elizabeth wasn't taking any chances. She opened the door before I could knock. At 55, Elizabeth Marshall carried herself with the same authority as her brother, but there was something different in her eyes. A warmth, perhaps, or maybe just less arrogance. "Mr. Sterling," she said coolly, "I've been expecting you." Inside, the house was warmly lit, comfortable, but not ostentatious. Elizabeth led me to a study overlooking the ocean. "Before we begin," she said, taking a seat behind a massive oak desk, "I want you to know that I knew your grandfather. That wasn't in our files." I kept my face neutral, waiting. "He was a good man," she continued. "What my father and brother did to him, it wasn't right. I tried to stop it. But I was young, just starting in the company. They wouldn't listen." "And now?" I asked carefully. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Now I own 15% of Marshall Industries. Not enough to control the company, but enough to make things very interesting if I were to, say, align myself with another significant shareholder." I leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Don't play coy, Mr. Sterling. I know you've been buying shares through shell companies. I know about the altered financial reports. I know about Marcus Wilson and the others. The question isn't what I'm proposing. It's whether you're ready for what comes next." She reached into her desk and pulled out a familiar-looking notebook. My heart stopped. "Your grandfather gave me this 30 years ago," she said softly. "He told me to keep it safe until someone worthy of the Sterling name came to reclaim it. I've been waiting for you, Oliver." The notebook contained another set of documents, board meeting minutes, original contracts, evidence of the earliest stages of Marshall's takeover scheme, pieces we had been missing. "Why help me?" I asked. Elizabeth's face hardened. "Because Richard is destroying our father's company. He cares about nothing but profit. Not the research, not the patients, not the employees. Marshall Industries used to stand for something. Your grandfather understood that. I think you do too." She stood, walking to the window. "I can give you my shares' voting rights by proxy. Combined with what you've acquired, that puts you at nearly 20%, enough to call for a special board review." I did some quick calculations. With Elizabeth's shares, plus what we'd acquired, plus the support we gathered from other minority shareholders. We could force a vote, I said slowly. Challenge Richard's leadership directly. Yes, Elizabeth smiled. But he won't go down without a fight. Are you ready for that? I thought of my grandfather's letter, of the years he spent gathering evidence, of the family he sacrificed everything to protect. I've been ready for 30 years. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Diana worked around the clock, preparing legal documents and coordinating with Elizabeth's attorneys. Marcus and his team continued gathering digital evidence of Marshall's ongoing corruption. James fed us regular updates from inside the company. But Richard Jr. wasn't stupid. He knew something was wrong. He just couldn't figure out what. Security at Marshall Industries tightened. Employees were questioned. Internal audits were launched. Then came the moment we'd been waiting for. I was in Diana's office when the call came. Richard Jr. himself, demanding a meeting with the mysterious new shareholders who had been accumulating stock. Tomorrow. Noon. My office, he barked into the phone. Diana looked at me, eyebrows raised. I nodded. Mr. Marshall, she replied smoothly, my client would prefer neutral ground. Shall we say the Sterling Mansion? I believe you're familiar with the property. There was a long pause. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost its arrogance. The Sterling House? What game are you playing? No game, Mr. Marshall. Just a long overdue family reunion. The next morning, I stood in my grandfather's study, watching Richard Marshall Jr.'s car pull up the long driveway. Diana had arranged everything perfectly. The original Sterling Pharmaceuticals documents laid out on the desk, the photos of my grandfather on the walls, even the chess set where he had taught me about patience and strategy. Richard entered the room like he owned it, but I saw him flinch when he recognized the furniture, the paintings, everything exactly as it had been 30 years ago when his father had sat here, plotting to steal my grandfather's company. Who are you? He demanded. I turned, letting him see my face clearly for the first time. Hello, Richard. My name is Oliver Sterling. I believe you knew my grandfather. The color drained from his face as he finally understood. The game wasn't just beginning. He had been playing it all along, and he had already lost. Richard Marshall Jr. stood frozen in my grandfather's study, his usual arrogance shattered by the sight of me, standing behind the massive oak desk. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the Sterling Pharmaceuticals logo on the documents spread before me. Impossible, he whispered. The Sterlings have no claim here. My father bought this company fair and square. I smiled, picking up my grandfather's leather notebook. Bought? Let's talk about how your father actually acquired Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Diana stepped into the room, carrying a thick folder. Mr. Marshall, I'm Diana Chen, representing Sterling Holdings. We have some rather interesting documents to discuss. Richard's eyes narrowed. Whatever you think you have, it won't hold up. The acquisition was 30 years ago. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing fraud. Diana interrupted smoothly. Would you like to see the evidence of financial manipulation from last quarter? Or shall we start with the original forged documents from 1993? I watched his face carefully, noting every micro-expression. The flash of fear when Diana mentioned recent fraud. The tightening of his jaw at the mention of 1993. He was realizing, piece by piece, just how thorough our investigation had been. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I opened my grandfather's notebook to a marked page. June 15, 1993. Your father meets with Harold Chen at the Grand Plaza Hotel. They discuss using offshore accounts to manipulate Sterling Pharmaceuticals' stock price. Shall I continue? Richard's face went pale. Harold Chin had been his father's closest confidant, the only other person who knew the full extent of the takeover scheme. Harold had died 10 years ago, taking his secrets to the grave. Or so Richard had thought. That's impossible. Those meetings were private. My grandfather was very thorough, I replied, turning to another page. He had people watching your father's every move, recording every meeting, documenting every betrayal. Diana laid out more documents on the desk: bank statements, board meeting minutes, email printouts, 3 decades of evidence, all leading to this moment. You have a choice, Richard, I continued. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Either way, Marshall Industries is about to experience some significant changes. He laughed, but it was hollow. You think you can just walk in here with some old documents and take my company? I have the best lawyers in the country. Your company? Elizabeth Marshall's voice cut through the room as she entered. Last I checked, I own 15% of Marshall Industries, and I'm quite interested in what Mr. Sterling has to say. Richard spun to face his sister, genuine fear flickering across his face for the first time. Elizabeth? You're part of this? I've been part of this for 30 years, Richard. Ever since I watched you and Father destroy a good man's life's work. I pressed a button on my phone. Marcus, are you ready? Yes, sir. Marcus's voice came through the speaker. All systems accessed. Financial records secured. Backup servers locked down. Just give the word. Richard's face contorted with rage. Wilson, my head of cybersecurity is working for you? Former head of cybersecurity, I corrected, along with quite a few other Marshall employees who were tired of your family's corruption. Elizabeth stepped forward, placing a USB drive on the desk. This contains evidence of every illegal transaction, every manipulated research report, every falsified drug trial from the past 5 years. Your tenure as CEO has been well documented, brother. The board won't stand for this, Richard snarled. The board, Diana interjected, is already calling for an emergency meeting. It seems someone leaked some very interesting financial documents this morning. I watched Richard's world crumbling around him. Everything he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers, just like my grandfather had felt 30 years ago. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. I sat down in my grandfather's chair, feeling the weight of 3 decades of waiting. First, you will resign as CEO of Marshall Industries, effective immediately. Elizabeth will take over as interim CEO. Never. Second, I continued as if he hadn't spoken. Marshall Industries will be renamed Sterling Marshall Pharmaceuticals, acknowledging its true heritage. You can't. Third, you will sign a full confession detailing your father's illegal takeover of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, as well as your own subsequent crimes. Richard lunged forward, his face purple with rage. You think you can threaten me? Do you know who I am? Richard Marshall, Jr., I said calmly, son of a thief, perpetrator of fraud, and as of, I checked my watch, 20 minutes ago, subject of an SEC investigation. Diana handed him a newspaper. On the front page was the headline, Marshall Industries under federal investigation. CEO implicated in decades-long fraud. You're finished, Richard, Elizabeth said softly. The only question is whether you lead with some dignity or in handcuffs. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. He collapsed into a chair, suddenly looking old and tired. "The confession," he said hoarsely. "If I sign it, what happens? You'll be allowed to retire quietly. No criminal charges. Your reputation, relatively intact. Consider it more mercy than your father showed my grandfather." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Richard reached for the pen Diana offered. An hour later, I stood at the window watching Richard's car drive away for the last time. Elizabeth touched my arm gently. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. I nodded, thinking of the letter I'd found in the safe. He knew this day would come. He just had to wait for the right moment. "And the right person," Diana added. "You played this perfectly, Oliver." My phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Stock trading suspended. Board meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Everything's ready." The next morning, I stood in front of Marshall Industries' board of directors, no longer hiding in the shadows. The evidence was presented, Richard's confession was read, and the vote was unanimous. Sterling Marshall Pharmaceuticals was born, with Elizabeth Marshall as CEO and me as chairman of the board. As I left the boardroom, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Oliver? I just saw the news. Marshall Industries, the Sterling name. Was this why you were cleaning out your grandfather's house?" "Yes, Mother. He left us quite a legacy. It just took some time to reclaim it." There was a long pause. "He would be proud of you, Oliver. We all are." I smiled, touching the leather notebook in my pocket. "I know, Mother. I know." That evening, I returned to my grandfather's study, my study now. The chess set still sat where we played our last game. I picked up the king piece, remembering his words about patience and strategy. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Elizabeth. "The old research files you asked for," she said, placing a box on the desk. "Everything your grandfather was working on before. Well, before." I opened the box, pulling out a stack of worn folders. On top was a document titled Project Phoenix, Revolutionary Cancer Treatment Protocol. "He was close to a breakthrough," Elizabeth said softly. "Your grandfather was developing something that could have changed millions of lives. My father stopped the research because it wasn't profitable enough." I sat down at the desk, opening the file. My grandfather's notes were meticulous, his vision clear even after all these years. "Well then," I said, "I think it's time Sterling Marshall Pharmaceuticals got back to what it was meant to be, a company that puts people before profits." Elizabeth smiled. "Where do we start?" I looked at the chess set, then at my grandfather's photo on the wall. "We start by finishing what he began. All of it." 6 months later, I stood on a stage at Sterling Marshall Pharmaceuticals' annual shareholder meeting. Behind me, a screen displayed our latest breakthrough, the successful phase II trials of my grandfather's cancer treatment protocol. 30 years ago, I began. A great man had a vision of medicine that served humanity, not just profits. That vision was stolen, but it wasn't lost. It was preserved, protected, and passed down to those who would understand its true value. I looked out at the audience, seeing faces filled with hope and purpose. Today, we're not just reclaiming a company. We're reclaiming a legacy of innovation, integrity, and genuine care for human life. This is what Sterling Marshall Pharmaceuticals stands for. This is what my grandfather fought to protect. And this is just the beginning. The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. My eyes were fixed on my grandfather's portrait, now hanging prominently in the auditorium. He seemed to be smiling. as if he had known all along that this day would come. In my pocket, I felt the smooth surface of his chess piece, the king I'd kept all these months. The game was over, and we had won. But more importantly, we had reclaimed not just a company, but its soul. That evening, I returned to the mansion, to the attic where it had all begun. The safe stood open now, empty of its secrets, but full of promise. On my grandfather's desk lay the future: research proposals, development plans, ideas that would change lives. I picked up my phone and dialed Elizabeth's number. "Are you ready to begin phase 2? Her voice came back strong and clear. "Absolutely. Let's show the world what Sterling Marshall can really do." I smiled, looking at my grandfather's portrait. "Yes," I said, "let's make him proud."